The night of my grandmother's birthday party, I had been on my feet for 3 days straight. 3 days of chopping, simmering, tasting, and adjusting. 3 days of grocery runs at 6 in the morning and dishes stacked so high in the sink they nearly touched the cabinet above it. 3 days of planning a menu for 40 people, sourcing the right ingredients, timing every dish, so nothing would go cold before my grandmother even sat down. I wasn't a professional chef. I was just a woman who loved to cook, who had spent years quietly mastering the kind of food that made people close their eyes on the first bite. I had poured everything I had into that party. Everything. The dining room table looked beautiful. The food smelled incredible. Relatives came through the door one after another, and more than a few of them stopped mid-sentence when they caught the aroma drifting out of the kitchen. And then, 10 minutes into dinner, my father set down his fork. He didn't yell. He didn't even raise his voice. He just spoke, casually, conversationally, like he was commenting on the weather, and he said, in front of every single person at that table, "Let's be honest. No one really likes the food you cook." My mother laughed. 40 relatives went silent. And I stood there in my apron, holding a serving spoon with my hands still smelling like garlic and hours of work, and I felt something inside me go very, very still. Not broken. Not crushed. Still. Because in that moment, I didn't fall apart. I made a decision. 2 weeks later, strangers were lining up for my food. And my parents heard about it not from me, from someone else entirely. This is what happened in between. My name is Reva Callahan, and I grew up in a house where the kitchen was the most honest room in the building. Everything else in our home had layers to it, the careful performances at family dinners, the way my parents navigated relatives with practiced smiles, the unspoken rules about which topics were off-limits and which feelings were better left in a drawer. But the kitchen never lied. A dish either worked or it didn't. The flavors either sang, or they fell flat. You couldn't fake your way through a good meal. I started cooking when I was 11. My grandmother, my father's mother, the woman we were celebrating that night, was the one who first handed me a wooden spoon and told me to stop watching and start doing. She was a fierce, unsentimental woman in most areas of her life, but in the kitchen, she was patient. She showed me things without explaining them, and then watched me make mistakes until I understood why the explanation would have been useless without the experience. By the time I was in high school, I was making full dinners for the family several nights a week. Not because anyone asked me to, they didn't, but because I wanted to, because it was the one place in the house where I felt completely capable. My parents were not people who handed out compliments like they were free. My father, Howard, had built a small contracting business from the ground up, and he ran our household with the same blunt efficiency he applied to everything else. He wasn't cruel, not in the way people usually mean. He didn't shout or slam doors. But he had a gift for minimizing things, a sentence here, a dismissal there, and those sentences had a way of sticking around long after he'd forgotten he'd said them. My mother, Patricia, was softer in her manner but rarely in her effect. She had a habit of agreeing with whoever had spoken last, which meant that when my father minimized something, she usually echoed it. I had learned over many years to stop expecting much from either of them in the area of acknowledgement. I cooked because I loved to cook, not because anyone was watching. That, I told myself, was enough. I had a stable job as a graphic designer at a mid-sized firm in the city. I had a small apartment 20 minutes from my parents' house. I had a handful of close friends who came over regularly for dinner and left with full stomachs and requests for recipes. My life was quiet and satisfying in the way that lives can be when you've learned to stop asking for things you're not going to receive. And then my grandmother's 80th birthday came around. She had not asked for a big celebration. She had specifically said, multiple times, that she did not want a fuss. This was ignored, as it always was, because in our family, a milestone birthday was not really about the person being celebrated. It was about everyone else having an occasion. The party was set for a Saturday in late autumn. My aunts and uncles would come in from across the state. Cousins I hadn't seen in years were flying in. We were expecting somewhere between 35 and 40 guests, and someone needed to handle the food. That someone, it was decided, mostly by my mother, in a phone call that framed it as a wonderful opportunity rather than a significant amount of unpaid labor, was me. I didn't object. I wanted to do it. I planned the menu carefully. I wanted it to feel like something. Not catered, not potluck, actually cooked, with attention, with care. The kind of meal that told a story. I chose dishes that took time, that rewarded patience, a slow-roasted centerpiece, hand-rolled sides, desserts made from scratch. I cross-referenced the guest list for dietary restrictions. I bought twice what I needed in case something went wrong. I started cooking on the Wednesday, before the Saturday party. I was at my parents' house by 7 in the morning each of those days, working until late at night, and then driving home to sleep a few hours before coming back. My hands were raw by Friday evening. My feet ached. I didn't care. I was proud of what I was making. And that, I think, was the problem. The guests arrived in the way family always does, in waves, with noise and perfume and the particular chaos of people who haven't seen each other in a long time and are performing warmth rather than simply feeling it. My aunts and uncles came first. Air kisses, gift bags for my grandmother, the usual circuit of hellos and "How are you?" and "You look wonderful" directed at everyone except possibly the people who needed to hear it. My cousins filtered in behind them, half distracted by their phones, arms open for hugs, and then retreating again. The dining room table stopped people in their tracks. I watched it happen. That pause when someone walks through a doorway and the smell hits them and they stop talking mid-sentence because their brain has registered something that deserves attention. One of my aunts actually covered her mouth with her hand. "You ordered all this from outside?" she asked. "She cooked it," my mother said. There was a scan, a brief, assessing look up and down, the kind that measures whether a person matches what they've apparently produced. Then a smile that landed just shy of genuine. "Well," my aunt said, patting my arm lightly, "we'll see how it tastes." She said it like a joke. The kind of joke that has a sharp edge underneath it. I smiled back and said, quietly, "You will." Dinner began once my grandmother was seated and the first round of toasts had been made. I stood near the sideboard, keeping dishes filled, watching. Uncle Terence, notoriously difficult, a man who sent food back at restaurants as a hobby, took a cautious spoonful of one of the slow-cooked sides. 2 minutes later, he came back for more. I caught one of my younger cousins telling her sister, under her breath, that the roasted dish was really good. An aunt I'd always been a little afraid of made eye contact with me across the table and gave me a small, real nod. People went back for seconds. Then thirds. Conversation filled the room. For a brief, fragile stretch of time, everything felt the way I had hoped it would. And then my father set down his fork. He didn't stand. He didn't make an announcement. He simply picked up his glass, looked around the table, and spoke in the same tone he used to discuss weekend traffic. "Well," he said, "let's be honest. No one really likes the food you cook." The room didn't fall silent all at once. It stumbled. A laugh somewhere died mid-breath. A conversation wound down without a conclusion. I watched expressions shift, recalibrate, people turning toward my father, then toward me, trying to determine the temperature of the room before committing to a reaction. My mother laughed, that high, brittle sound that always meant she decided to agree with whoever had just spoken. "People are just being polite," she added. A few uncomfortable sounds went around the table. Not agreement, not disagreement, that specific social noise people make when they are actively hoping someone else will decide what's happening first. At the far end, one of my quieter cousins said, very softly, "It's actually good." My father didn't pause. "It's fine," he said, cutting smoothly across the table. "Not everyone has talent." He said talent the way you'd say a word you'd already looked up the meaning of and found disappointing. And then the moment, that small, possible moment when someone might have spoken, when someone might have pushed back, passed. My cousin looked down at her plate. The aunt who'd made the "we'll see" comment became suddenly absorbed in her salad. Uncle Terence stared at his glass. No one said, "That's not true." No one said, "That was a cruel thing to say." I stood there with a serving spoon in my hand, and I looked at my father, this man who had eaten more of my food than probably anyone alive, who had sat at my table more times than I could count, and I understood something clearly for the first time. He wasn't speaking from experience. He had never tasted my food with an open mind. Every meal I had ever placed in front of him had already been judged before it reached his plate. Not by flavor, not by effort, not by any honest measure, but by the simple fact that I had made it. I was always going to be too small to be worth noticing, unless I stopped asking him to do the noticing. I set the serving spoon down very carefully on the sideboard. I excused myself from the room. I went to the kitchen, leaned against the counter, and breathed. And then I washed my face at the sink, dried my hands on a clean towel, and went back out to finish serving. I didn't cry. I didn't make a scene. I didn't say a single word. But something had shifted. Something quiet and permanent and important. That night, after the last guest left and the dishes were washed and my parents had gone to bed, I sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop. My hands still smelled faintly of garlic and the herbs I'd used for the centerpiece. I opened a blank browser tab, and I started to build something. I had been thinking about it for months, actually, the idea of taking my cooking somewhere beyond my own kitchen. But thinking about something and doing it are separated by a distance that most people never cross, and for a long time I'd let that distance stand. My father's voice at the dinner table closed it. I wasn't doing this to prove anything to him. I want to be clear about that because I've been asked. I wasn't doing it out of spite or revenge or any need to wave something in his face. I was doing it because I was done asking for permission from him, from my mother, from the careful aunt with her thin smile, from any of them, to believe that what I made had value. I spent the first night researching farmers markets and local food events in my city. I spent the second night figuring out permits, regulations, what it would actually cost to set up a small vendor stall. I made calls. I sent emails. I got information. Then I called my friend Tasha, who worked in event coordinating and had been telling me for 2 years that I needed to do something with my food, and told her what I was planning. There was a pause on the line. Then she said, "Riva." "Yes." "Tell me what you need." Within a week, Tasha had connected me with a weekend artisan market about 15 minutes from my apartment. The organizer had a cancellation in the vendor lineup and was willing to give me a trial spot for a 2-week run. It wasn't a guarantee. It wasn't a big deal. It was a folding table and a canopy and a Saturday morning and whatever I decided to put on it. I made a small menu. For items, each one something I'd refined over years. Each one the kind of thing that couldn't be rushed and couldn't be faked. I costed it out, sourced the ingredients, figured out packaging. I drove to a restaurant supply store and bought containers and labels. I designed a simple sign using my graphic design skills. Clean, warm, professional. The name I chose for the stall was quiet and personal. Riva's Table. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't post about it on social media beforehand. I didn't ask anyone's permission or opinion. I just showed up on Saturday morning, set up my table, and waited. The first hour was slow. I stood behind my table in the morning cold, watching people move past with their tote bags and their coffee cups, nodding at the ones who slowed down to look. A woman stopped. She was in her 50s, neat gray coat, and she had the look of someone who had been to a lot of markets and was not easily impressed. She picked up the little card describing the slow-roasted dish, read it, and then looked up at me. "Did you make this yourself?" "From scratch," I said. "Started it last night." She bought one. She came back 12 minutes later. "Can I get 2 more?" she asked. "One for my neighbor." That was the first shift. By noon, the table had a small crowd around it. Not a frenzy, not a stampede, just a genuine, steady cluster of people tasting samples and asking questions and pulling out their wallets. A man told me it was the best thing he'd eaten at a market in years. A young couple bought 4 containers and asked if I'd be there next week. A woman who ran a catering company stopped, tasted, and handed me her business card before walking away without saying much else. I sold out by 1:30 in the afternoon. I stood at my empty table in the weak autumn sunlight and felt something that I hadn't felt in a long time. Not pride, exactly. Something quieter and more durable than pride. Something that didn't need a single other person to confirm it. I came back the following Saturday. And the one after that. Word moved the way it does in those communities. Person to person, phone to phone, a quick text to a friend saying you have to try this place at the market. By my 4th Saturday, there was a line before I'd even finished setting up. The catering company owner came back, this time with a proposal. She had a private event in 6 weeks, and she wanted me to handle a portion of the food. I said yes. I hired a part-time assistant to help me prep. I registered as a small food business. I opened a simple website with a contact form and photographs I'd taken myself in my kitchen. My life, quietly and methodically and entirely on my own terms, was changing. It was my Aunt Cheryl who told them. Aunt Cheryl was my mother's sister, a woman I'd always liked more than most of my relatives because she had a directness about her that didn't leave room for the usual games. She had heard about the market from a friend of a friend, shown up on a Saturday without knowing it was me, tasted the food, and then read the name on the sign. She called me that same afternoon, laughing in disbelief. "Riva," she said, "I just ate at your stall, and I had no idea it was you. This is incredible. Why didn't you tell anyone?" I told her I'd wanted to see if it worked first. There was a pause. Then, gently, "It works, sweetheart. It really, really works." She said she'd been telling people. I asked her not to make a big thing of it with my parents yet. She said she understood but couldn't make promises, and I respected her for saying so rather than lying about it. 3 days later, my mother called. She had, apparently, heard about Riva's table from 2 separate people at her book club before she'd connected the name to me. One of them had been going every week. Another had placed a bulk order for an office event. She called me, and her first words were, "Why didn't you tell us?" I thought about what to say for a moment. Then I said, I needed to know if it was real without anyone's opinion in the room while I was figuring that out. There was a silence. She said, "Well, people are saying very good things." "I know," I said. My father called 2 days after that. His call was shorter. He said he'd heard I was doing something with food at a market. I confirmed that, yes, I was. He said he'd heard people liked it. I said yes, they seemed to. There was a pause, and then he said, in that same flat, weather forecast tone, "Well, good." That was it. No acknowledgement of the dinner party. No acknowledgement of what he'd said. No, I was wrong, or I'm sorry. Just, good. I had not expected anything different. And I realized, with a calm that surprised me, that I didn't need anything different. I wasn't doing this for the conversation I might eventually have with my father. I was doing it because it was mine. The private catering job 6 weeks later was the kind of event that changes the shape of things. It was a milestone birthday celebration for a woman named Octavia Brennan, 60 years old, the kind of person who knew everyone worth knowing in the local food and hospitality scene. The catering company I was partnering with, run by a woman named Sandra, had specifically requested that my dishes anchor the savory portion of the menu. I spent 2 weeks preparing. I tested each dish 4 times. I sourced ingredients from 3 different suppliers to make sure I had the quality I needed. I hired 2 people to help me on the day of the event. The night went beautifully. Octavia Brennan found me near the end of the evening, still in my kitchen work clothes, and shook my hand for a long time. She told me that 3 people had asked her where the food had come from. She said she'd given out my card to everyone who'd asked. One of those people was the editor of a regional lifestyle magazine. The article ran 6 weeks later. A full page, with photographs I hadn't even known they were taking. The headline was something about hidden gems in the local food scene. My name was in the first paragraph. My phone didn't stop buzzing for 4 days. Sandra called me to say she wanted to formalize our arrangement, a consistent contract, real rates, a standing collaboration. I said yes. I negotiated the terms. I had a lawyer look over the contract, which was something the version of me standing in my parents' kitchen with a serving spoon would never have thought to do, and I signed it. By the time winter came, Riva's table had a waiting list for private orders. I was not, by any measure, a famous chef. I wasn't a restaurant owner. I wasn't rich, not yet. But I had built something real, in the time between a dinner party and December, out of nothing but my own skills and the decision, made in a kitchen, hands smelling like garlic, heart very still, to stop waiting for someone else to tell me I was worth something. My grandmother asked me to come to her house for the holiday. A smaller gathering this time, immediate family, no grand production. I went. I brought food, because of course I did. My father was there. My mother was there. A handful of aunts and uncles and cousins who had been at the birthday party were there. And something was different. Not dramatic. Not a confrontation or a speech or a reversal, so complete it read like fiction. Just different. Uncle Terence, who had been the most skeptical person in the room at the birthday party, pulled me aside before dinner. He'd been to the market. He'd read the article. He said, in the grudging way of a man who considers acknowledgement a limited resource, "You've got something real there." The aunt who had said, "We'll see," sat across from me at dinner and asked about the catering job. She wanted to know if I did private bookings for small dinner events. I told her I was building out that side of the business. My grandmother, who had eaten in near silence at her own birthday while her son insulted his daughter's cooking, reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. She didn't say anything. She just held it for a moment and then let go. My father ate his dinner quietly. At one point, he looked up and caught me looking at him, and he said, "This is good." He meant the food. I said, "Thank you." That was the whole conversation. And here's the thing I've spent a lot of time thinking about since then. I had wanted for a very long time for him to see me.
To really see me.
To sit at a table and look at what I'd made and feel something, admiration, maybe, or even just simple respect. I had wanted that so much that I'd cooked for 40 people and stayed on my feet for 3 days hoping that this time would be different. What I got instead was a small, ordinary sentence across a holiday table. "This is good." And it was enough. Not because it was what I'd always wanted, but because I had stopped needing it to be more. Reva's table is a real business. I didn't quit my design job overnight. I'm practical, and the overlap gave me stability while I built the other thing. But 6 months after the birthday party, the catering side had grown enough that I reduced my hours at the firm. A year out, I had shifted completely. The regional magazine article was followed by a feature in a food-focused newsletter. The newsletter was followed by a small but loyal following on social media that I built through word of mouth and simple, honest content. No performance, no pretense, just the food, the process, and occasionally the story of a woman who started taking herself seriously after someone important to her publicly refused to. Sandra and I are now equal partners in a catering company with a real client list and a team of 5. My grandmother came to one of our market days this past spring. She arrived early, before the crowds, with her cane and her good coat, and she stood at my table and watched people buy my food for 2 hours without saying much. When I walked her back to her car at the end, she finally spoke. She said, "I always knew. I just needed you to know it too." I didn't cry until I was in my car. My relationship with my parents is complicated and ongoing, the way those relationships always are. My father has not fully acknowledged what he said at the party, not in any direct way. My mother has settled into a pride that she wears like she discovered it herself. I have let both of these things be what they are. What I know is this. That night, standing in the kitchen after everyone had gone home, I had a choice. I could carry what he said as proof of something, proof that I wasn't enough, proof that trying was pointless, proof that the people who were supposed to see you were allowed to make you invisible. Or I could carry it as a beginning. I chose the beginning. I think about the version of myself who set down that serving spoon and walked to the kitchen and pressed her back against the counter and breathed. She was not dramatic. She did not make a speech. She did not fall apart or lash out or demand an apology in front of 40 relatives. She just got very quiet, and then she got very clear. And that clarity, that one still, certain moment, became the foundation for everything that came after. Here's what I've learned. The people who diminish you in public are rarely doing it because they believe it's true. They're doing it because they've already decided where you belong in their understanding of the world. And no amount of evidence will change a conclusion that was never based on evidence in the first place. The only answer to that is to stop presenting the evidence to the wrong jury. Build the thing. Do it in silence. Let the work exist in spaces where the judgment has no history, no stake, no personal investment in keeping you small. And then let the work speak. It always speaks louder than the people who try to shout it down. Before you go, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want to know your answer. Has someone in your own life ever dismissed something you were good at, not because they actually believed you weren't capable, but because admitting it would require them to see you differently? And what did you do with that? Leave it in the comments. I read every single one. If this story moved you, you're exactly who Velyra Payback is for. We put up a new story every single day, Real, emotional, first person, the kind that stays with you. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss tomorrow's. I'll see you there.